and hopefully we can have some conversations about it. Pirkei Avos.
Now I see the names.
Okay, today it's Rabbi Yonason. Rabbi Yonason is also a student of Rabbi Akiva. And he says, Kol hamakayim es ha-Torah ma'oni. Anyone who fulfills the Torah, keeps the Torah, meaning does mitzvahs, while they're poor. Sofo, in the end, l'kayim ma'osher. In the end, they will fulfill it in a state of wealth. Anyone who kind of nullifies the Torah, whether it's the study of Torah, it's the performance of Torah, while they're wealthy, sofo, in the end, levatzla ma'oni. In the end, they will kind of discard it, not pay attention to it, even when they're poor. So there are a few things that are interesting about this, and it also kind of shifts. You see generationally different interpretations, but the Vilna Gaon already, so he dies in 1797, he says the struggle of being wealthy is a greater test than the adversity of being poor. And the way that he explains it, and he says it even differently, he says it like more than the poor need the wealthy need the poor. That's, I think, how he frames it. And so one understanding is that we all have to kind of give a din v'cheshbon. We have to give some sort of calculation for like what we did with our lives. And, how did we make our resources, whether it's the resources of time or financial resources or creativity, how did we make those useful for the world? So the more that a person has, the more they have to give an accounting for. A person has $20, so God says, well, how could, God's not going to ask, well, how come you didn't build this building or, donate this wing of a hospital? Person has $20 billion, that's a lot to have to account for, because with $20 billion, you can change the world. So what did you do with that? So the way the Vilna Gaon understands it is that we're in relationship to each other through God, and that it's a circle. This is what the Gemara talks a lot about, is the Gilgul HaChezer. There's some people are on top, some people at different stages of their lives, like the wheel turns. Sometimes they're in a position to give, sometimes they're leaner years where they need to receive. But what goes around comes around. And so what the author of this mission is saying is that don't see the number in your bank account as being an excuse to make time for study or not. A person say, listen, if I didn't have to work so hard, then I'd be able to sit and learn all day. So the Gemara says to this, are you more poor than Hillel? Hillel was really poor. Hillel was a wood chopper. I'm sure we've said over these stories, but the Gemara says a story that they used to have an entrance fee to get into the study hall. And the entrance fee was not for administrative purposes, but it was to pay the bouncer. They needed to provide security for the study hall. And so a person would have to pay to gain entrance. So he was a wood chopper. And so he would chop enough wood so that for the day, he could pay to get in. And then he was done working. And one day it was the winter, and I think there was snow on the ground already, but there was for whatever reason, he wasn't able to chop any wood. He couldn't pay the fee to get in, but he wanted to hear the lecture of the day. So he climbed onto the skylight, put his ear to the glass or to whatever the roof they had to listen in. And then a huge snowstorm came, and it was only when there was a lot of snow there that they were actually able to see the sun casting a shadow through his body, and somebody went up there and saved him from freezing to death. And then they abolished the rule of having to pay money to get in. But the point is, the Gemara says that he obligates all people who are suffering or experiencing poverty, because nobody was more poor than Hillel, and Hillel became the leader of his generation. And so too, on the other end, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who's the author who redacted this Mishnah, he doesn't have attribution, but he's the one who recorded it, he was exceedingly wealthy. They talk about how it didn't make a difference. So one of the things that I do for Shabbos, Wendy likes flowers. Every year of Shabbos, I get flowers. It's a small token of appreciation to honor the Shabbos and to make Wendy happy. Wendy loves tulips. Tulips evidently are seasonal. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and I grew up in a place where I don't think that we had seasons for flowers. I think the flowers we got, you can get all the flowers you can always get year round. But here at the local place, you can only get tulips at certain parts of the year. It says about Rebbe's table, it didn't make a difference how exotic the fruit or the vegetable, they were available year round. So before freezers, before refrigerators, that was quite an accomplishment. So he was exceedingly wealthy, and he was the leader of the generation. So part of the perspective here is to recognize that if a person sees themselves in partnership with God, God has unlimited resources. If a person is experiencing, a leaner time, it's not because God doesn't care about them. It doesn't mean that God couldn't make the person wealthy. It means that at this stage of their life, that this is what is good for them. It's difficult. It's difficult to ever understand why God does anything. Why is there ever any sort of pain or suffering? But if a person thinks about that, their relationship with God as I'm here to do the right thing, regardless of the immediate benefit, but I'm in relationship to do the right thing. So a person is willing to kind of demonstrate that in times which are difficult. The Mishnah says, like, okay, this too will pass, and the mazel will change, and a person will then be able, even when in wealth, not only even in wealth, but will somehow, it's not clear if it's like a reward for being faithful when it's difficult, but will experience this world in a place of easier financial situation. But when a person is able to demonstrate it when it's a sacrifice, so it means more to them, and then they'll be able to appreciate it when it's not such a sacrifice. And for somebody who was in a position to be fortunate enough to have resources, if at those moments when a person, can kind of have the flexibility to have those resources to make life a little bit more comfortable, and still you can't make time, right, without the stress of paying the bills. So then at some point the wheel will turn, and a person will be in a position without that kind of generous state, but they still won't kind of be able to appreciate it to be in a relationship with God. Okay, want to pause and open it up for thoughts or questions. Money in the Jewish tradition is never the goal. It's always a means to an end. So this is more about the interface between the two. Thoughts, questions, perspectives, Saul.
So I was thinking about what you just said, what the Vilna Gaon said, because you have to know the poor. It's certainly, okay, life has changed with the television and the internet. But growing up, when my neighborhood was all Jews and Italians, and who was poor in the neighborhood that I grew up with? And I grew up in Brooklyn and went to a public high school with over 5,000 students.
Wow.
Now, there were Black students in the school, but I never saw them. They were not in my classes. And if I continued to live in that kind of bubble, I would never know anybody who was Black, and I would never know anybody. So what are you talking about that I have to know? Yes, we gave tzedakah. My Bubby always had the tzedakah boxes, and they came and they collected. So, and was it Maimonides who said even the poor have to give tzedakah? That's right. No matter how poor you are, there's somebody worse off than you are. That's right. that need your help. And my grandmother certainly, she did that. But you have to know the poor. Otherwise, if you have a lot of money and you're only with your own kind and your children, I mean, I'm really thinking about the children, the obnoxious who I used to teach, they don't know those kind of people. It's a shock.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful point that part of the responsibility of those with means is to know how to efficiently distribute them. And part of that is a function of proximity, that how can you actually, so there's this famous, right, to give a person a fish, they'll eat for a day, but you teach them how to fish, right? And Maimonides actually has 7 levels of charitable giving, and there's aspects of giving it anonymously, but empowerment, I don't know if we've said this over yet, but the word for chesed is the words that we use. We for sure, I think, said this over when we first started 4 chapters ago. Is gemilut chasodim, right? Acts of kindness, and the root of that first word is gamal. We read it now in these parshas. The day by Isaac. It's a big dispute. What does it mean? One dispute it was the day that he was weaned from his mother. But anyways, the word gamal means at least 3 things. It means acts of charity. It means to wean. And it also is the Hebrew word for the animal, the camel, the gamal. And so one of the interpretations is that these three words spelled the same way represent a certain level of self-sufficiency, right? The ideal type of chesed is that somebody should become independent, that they don't need to come on to other people for help, but that they should be in a position to provide for themselves and, God willing, for others. The camel is the animal that is able to kind of retain the most amount of liquid to be able to keep itself hydrated. Needs people, and then of course being weaned, you're no longer dependent on a person, to nurse you. And so I think that there is something to be said that if a person feels like, look, I have money, I have to give 10% or whatever a person does, and then like you check the box and you write the check. So that's actually like not helpful. Like it's helpful, right? Because then you give it to organizations, hopefully, who are involved in relationship building. But I think historically it was a function of like, okay, who needs help and how can I be helpful? And that was a function of knowing people. Rav Moshe Feinstein, whose son just passed away last week. Rav Moshe Feinstein was the biggest rabbi in America. He was born in Russia. He dies like in the mid 1980s. But his son, he still has one son that's alive. One son just passed away at 91. But Rav Moshe writes that a person has to tithe their time. That when we think about donating, it's not just enough to, right? Somebody's retired, somebody doesn't, have kind of any sort of source of income. So, but a person is alive, and if they're capable of helping somebody, so they need to be able to donate time as well. So there's a whole interesting calculation. How, there's 24 hours in the day. That means 2.4 hours of every day. So there's a whole calculation how that works. But if a person's not volunteering a few hours a day, whether that's in making phone calls or, I see Harold, cleans up the leaves and the trash at the park. Different, and everybody does the thing that, like, you don't have to volunteer in a place that's painful for you. The Gemara actually gives all sorts of mechanisms or criteria to figure out how to prioritize. The simple kind of rubric is if somebody should compute where they're strong, whatever. Say that differently. To the extent that the contribution can be uniquely yours, is to the extent that you should prioritize that work over another. Meaning, if somebody else can do it, let somebody else do it. Do the things that nobody else can do, but you. And often, so that is a function of the relationship that you have with the person. Nobody else has this relationship with the person. The person wouldn't listen to. Nobody else can help them. So it is a function of proximity. And we also have seen, like, who's a wealthy person. We saw it earlier in the chapter, I think. Right? Somebody who is samech b'chelkai, right? And part of that means, like, who wouldn't want to have a hospital wing, bearing their name? Who wouldn't want awards and things in their, like, everybody would want, right, to be known as somebody who gives and cares. But that's not the portion of most of us. Most of us do work that gets very little recognition. Some of us get too much recognition. I find myself in the category of getting too much recognition for the work. But a lot of the good type of work is kind of it's not appreciated. In fact, in the Mishaberach that we say on Shabbos, the Mishaberach reads that we should bless for all those who engage in communal work be'emunah, with faith. And the rabbis say it takes a lot of faith to be involved in communal action, because everybody kvetches. It's never exactly the way that anybody else wanted it. You have to deal with other people who have different visions. And we've spoken about all the board meetings, right? Like, you have to have faith to do this type of work. But I think that's part of this, that if a person is able, I think that's part of the messaging of the mission, that if a person is able to kind of be engaged when one is poor, right, then a person at some point can feel like they're no longer poor. They feel like they're actually quite, what does it mean to be wealthy today? I mean, if you live in New York City, if you want to own an apartment here, right, I'm from Richmond, Virginia. You can't buy houses there for what apartments here cost. They just don't make them that big. Like, it's just a different scale. And so it's a very different kind of world. And for people who are accustomed, to different types of lifestyles, when those things shift, it can be traumatic in both directions. People inherit all sorts of money very quickly. They're not equipped to know how to handle it. People often find themselves much worse off than when they started. So, but I think one of the messages here is that it doesn't make a difference how much money a person has. They can actually be quite impoverished. And it doesn't make a difference how little money a person has. They can be very wealthy. And that really is determined by the worldview. Does a person feel blessed to be alive? Does a person feel like they are empowered, right? The Gemara talks in a few places about what does it mean to be alive. being alive means to make a difference, to have an impact. And I'm sure we've spoken about this in different ways. And so the Gemara says there are actually some people who are alive who are called dead, right? And it's a function of, are they making a difference? Is the world the same with them? The relationships that they have with people, are those positive relationships that the world and the people in their orbit are different because of them? And that's what it means to be wealthy, to be able to make a difference. Sometimes that's with a check, sometimes that's with a smile. But I think that's kind of the core of the Mishnah, that when we feel connected to God and we're able to be makayim it, we're able to fulfill it, right? We're living our, there's a really interesting book for people who have extra time on their hands and enjoy reading books and want a different perspective. I cannot give an approbation on all of it because some of it is a little bit out there, but there's a book that's put out, I think it's by Art Scroll, it's called Holy Woman. And the book is written by a Jewish woman who was raised secular and then kind of became observant and then kind of ultra-Orthodox, and is writing a story about a woman who had a very difficult life. I think she's since passed away, but only passed away relatively recently. Had a very, very, very difficult life, but presented as one of the happiest people alive. She and her husband went through the war, lost family, themselves were never had children, were never able to have children, but basically adopted severely challenged adults, like kids that really, they would raise them from being children through adolescence. They often didn't live very long into adulthood, but that's really what they did. They took in people that otherwise would have been institutionalized, and it was like a nonstop, very difficult. She goes then, there was a constant kind of daily of cooking and cleaning them and bathing them, and like it wasn't simple. And they were like the floor was, you could see the ground. They were very, 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 very poor physically in terms of monetary resources, but she says that you could not have met people that were more happy. You couldn't. She said it was just, there was this space of divine light that just came from an awareness that our lives are not for ourselves, our lives are for other people. Anyways, in that book, and it's a hard book to read because some of it's like just hard, but this woman said to her about a definition of what's a good place and what's a bad place. She said a good place is where you can be in relationship with God. A bad place is where you can't. And she said even in the camps, there were moments where I felt like, for me, I was able to be in relationship with God. And that's what she attributes to being able to get through it. But it's a hard book, but it's a perspective. And for people who are able to find value and appreciate opportunities in the moment. So sometimes those moments in the environment can be, hell on earth. But for some people, they're able to see. My grandfather used to say, if you have one slice of bread, you can give half of it to your friends. And I don't know why I've been reading Holocaust things recently, but there's a very famous story, I think it was the Bluzhova Rebbe. There are a bunch of stories with him. But one story, if I remember correctly, with him is a person comes after World War II, and he comes to the Rebbe and he's like, Rebbe, I saw things. There's no God. I want nothing to do with Judaism. Humanity, it failed. And so beyond the obvious, the Rebbe said, can you just share, one experience that you feel proved to you that there's no. And he said, I saw that in my barracks, there was a person, they had a prayer book. And instead of letting people use the prayer book, they would kind of rent it or lease it out for short spurts in return for scraps of bread and food. And I thought, how can a person use religion in such a way to take from other people in that way? And so the Bluzhova Rebbe said, you're right, what he did was really wrong. But what about all those people who are willing to sacrifice food to be able to have a prayer in a prayer book? And so it is a function of perspective. And I think, again, just what the Mishnah here is saying is that wealth and poverty, it's subjective. It's subjective. If we think about where people were 200 years ago, the poorest people today have access to things that the wealthiest people didn't have 200 years ago. And the system is broken, and there's a lot of work to be done. No one should ever experience homelessness. But when we think about our relationship with society, there are people who are devoid of wealth and have a lot of money in their accounts, and there are people who have no money in their accounts and are priceless. So I think that's part of the perspective. Sorry to go to such dark places. This week is Trans Day of remembrance, and it's just I don't know. It's hard for me. It's hard to think about how broken the world is, and for those of us who are in privileged spaces where we don't have to worry about being murdered for walking out of who we are. I don't know. There's just there's a weightiness on it this year for me that just feels harder than in past years. So that's what I got. All right, friends, it's a beautiful day outside. I hope that people are able to chase the joy and find it. Hopefully tomorrow's Mishnah will be a little bit more positive. I am sorry for bringing too much emotion to it, but
never a problem. That's never a problem. You're only human.
I am only human, but
Rabbi,
yeah.
we are going through very difficult emotional times because there's ups and downs, and it's going to last until, unfortunately, January 20th, because you just don't know what each day will bring. So it definitely, every event takes on a very momentous meaning. And I just, since you're mentioning the Holocaust, I was reading an article in the forward about Holocaust survivors who have been emotional state right now because of what's happening and the elation that he won, but what he's doing now that's causing them a whole new renewed anxiety. So, I mean, I just want to say you're entitled.
Thank you. I know I'm in good company. I know I'm in very good company in this group and in the world of people. I saw that article. It's everything now about the Holocaust is, look, it's always hard. Deborah Lipstadt, I don't know if people are familiar with her or not. I know her through Hartman. She's a lovely human. Her voice is really important. And she's very sensitive to what she calls a Holocaust debasement, that whenever we compare anything to the Holocaust, there's this unintended consequence of saying, well, the Holocaust is only as bad as whatever we're comparing it to. And when the truth is we just don't have the language to describe things which are horrific without calling them a Holocaust. Like language is the problem in both directions. It's not my fear, it's the fear of the universe. What will be with all the memories, right? When nobody no longer is alive who can say I was there, and then it's the generation after, which becomes, the spokes, the witnesses. But it's a beautiful world, and there's a lot of reasons to be joyous. It would be a lot worse if there wasn't, if the elections didn't go this way, and still these transitions are difficult, and doubt is, it's a longer conversation, but the Hebrew word for doubt, safek, is the same numerical value as the Hebrew word for Amalek, which is this horrible nation that fought us after the splitting of the state. And whenever somebody says, well, how do you know? Maybe it's not true. It's just right. Like maybe Trump won. Like we have a reality. We have access to things, and that question of doubt of like, well, how do you know? Maybe the world's flat. How do you know? It's just like, for intelligent people, it's not complicated. Like, well, because I don't know, like we went to the moon and we saw people. Well, how do you know we were actually on the moon? It's just okay. Like, you know what? I don't know what to tell you. Anyways, thank you for the virtual hugs, friends. All right, so God willing, I said, I don't know if anyone was at the Havdalah thing this week. I led it with Larry, and it was from my perspective lovely. But one of the things that I shared at the very beginning is that there is a shift of going into holiness, the spaces of holiness, like the Sabbath, where we kind of embrace the commonality of individuality. We light Shabbos candles. They're distinct. They're different. People have different customs. How many Shabbos candles do you light? But when we go out of those safe spaces of spirituality, and then we go into the darkness, into the night, into the mundane, into the weekday, we used a multi-wick candle, because in those moments, it's so important to come together to create, a more powerful light. So thank you for being the light, and looking forward to seeing people. God willing, I'll be in a more balanced space tomorrow. All right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're very welcome. See you soon. Take care.